Now, I'm sure you're fairly familiar with the Disney movie Moana, which is based in Polynesia. Well, I'm going to enlighten you with some of the actual history of the Maori, one of the most interesting and renowned Polynesian tribes. As while Disney was very culturally correct, I am historically accurate, so let us visit the island of Aotearoa, or as it's known in modern day, New Zealand. So, around the early 14th century, the Maori washed ashore. Originally, the Maori were Polynesians who scoured the waves of the Pacific. They inhabited small islands, and these people sailed all the way to New Zealand. Now let's compare a Polynesian island to New Zealand. Yeah, that's a bit of a difference. So the Maori decided to settle with these near unlimited supplies. And when they settled, they became isolated, and they sent out ships less and less, making them much like the islands they now lived on. New Zealand had been separated from the continents for about 80 million years, and because of that, there were no mammals, no pigs, no sheep, no cows. So what did the Maori eat? Well, there were two main food sources. One was a moa. These were demon birds straight from hell that could absolutely deck an emu if they wanted to, which is saying something. They stood at 3 meters tall. Like, these absolute units just inhabited the islands. But the Maori were having none of that. And since these moa were the apex predators of the island, they had no fear of these two-legged, featherless creatures. So, the Maori just went up and they eventually hunted the demon spawn to extinction, which to be honest, I'm not even sad about. It's because they would curb stomp anything if they were still around. The second source of food was far less terrifying. The Moriori. These were, humans, the original inhabitants of New Zealand. But the Moriori were primitive, inferior folk, and eventually, when the Maori arrived on these shores, they massacred, ate, and completely wiped out the Moriori people. Or at least, that's how the myth goes, and it probably isn't true. But when these food sources ran out, the Maori switched to farming, which they had known all along, even before, the whole cannibalism thing. But with food came community and settlements, and with settlements, clans needed fences. I introduced to you the pa. This is the fortification they would put around their settlements. They consisted of terraces of wooden spikes with trenches and hidden tunnels between them, meaning other tribes had to siege them, and this is where I present a true contester to the Trojan horse. The Nyati Curry. That whale. They made a whale out of paint and dogskin, and when the pa opened its gates, they leapt out and ended the siege. Now, much like Japan and Ireland, the Maori were split into clans that all spoke the same language. Those clans were known as iwi, and they were one of the most important things in Maori culture, along with mana, which is like karma, but you don't use it to cast spells in magic. They took mana very seriously. Wars were waged for good mana or against a tribe with bad mana, and war was waged a lot. It was mostly hand-to-hand warfare. But even their warboats, or waka, were made to crash into each other so they could actually go into hand-to-hand combat. But one thing that inhibited them were the foods they grew, which did not travel well or last long in winter away from storage. So war rarely lasted and didn't happen much during the winter. Another great feature of the Maori were their mythology, which included such gods as Maui, the one from that movie, who according to legend fished up the Northern Ireland, which is pretty cool. Look at this picture. That's pretty cool. But the Maori's isolation would not last, and eventually the Dutch washed up, and immediately got hit by a war waka, and fled. And in another 126 years, James Cook landed with his crew. They traded metal and potatoes with the natives, but the most influential of all trades was the musket. This revolutionized Maori warfare, but the pa came in clutch again, since not even gunpowder weapons could break through a pa. But this independence wasn't going to last, since the British had arrived and they wanted land. They presented a treaty to the Maori, or at least 500 of them, which said in Maori that the British would rule, but the Maori would still govern their land. But the English side said differently, saying that they basically owned the Maori land, and later, when more and more English moved in, taking Maori land, the Flagstaff War began, which then kicked up a nationwide insurrection. Despite the British having innumerable odds over the Maori had the pa, which was invulnerable to British weaponry, and technically this is one of the first examples of trench warfare, but sadly the British did overwhelm the Maori in the end, During the next several decades, Maori culture was near wiped out by British settlers. They were discriminated against, and their culture was nearing extinction, but they were not going to let that happen. They set up groups and marches until finally the Race Relations Act of 1971 was made, which prohibited discrimination against them. Not only did the Maori fight the discrimination, they even managed to get the Treaty of Waitangi Act to pass, leading to investigations into the breaches of the original treaty by the Maori definition instead of the British. And there was somewhat of a Maori renaissance, and it seems they will continue to return. But their battle isn't over yet, with there still being some discrimination in New Zealand. But they are getting their reputation back, and all seems to be going well on the island. That is the story of the Maori. Definitely the first inhabitants of New Zealand. Definitely. Goodbye.